Hi, this is John, trichologist at Freedom Clinic, Toronto, and I just wanted to talk today a little bit about the hair growth cycle and some of the implications of the hair growth cycle that most people should be aware of. Now, if you look at this chart on the computer here, what we see is a typical diagram of the hair growth cycle. You can see it's divided up into 4 stages. Most diagrams look like this, although it's a little incomplete, so I'm going to add a couple of little sections in. We'll talk about that too. So just to start off, the basic hair growth cycle lasts about, well, could be anywhere from 2 to 6 years. So every shaft of hair goes through this cycle. So it goes through a phase the first phase called the Anagen phase. This is where the hair follicle is actively producing a hair shaft. These are all the hair shafts that are growing on your head at any given time. So your hairs stay in this Anagen phase for, like I said, 2 to 6 years. And then what happens is there's usually about a 3-month, anywhere from 1 to 3 month period where the hair goes into a resting phase. Now the beginning of this resting phase is called Catagen. This is where the hair shaft, the bulb of the hair, actually separates from the dermal papilla. Here we see it's connected. Here in the Catagen stage, it's separated. So what's happening now is it's begun the process of leaving the hair follicle. The hair shaft will leave the hair follicle. The papilla, down at the bottom, the part that sort of drives the growth of the follicle of the hair shaft, retreats. So during this resting phase, we call that telogen. So the part where the hair is no longer growing, but it's sitting in the follicle, and the papilla is resting. We call that the telogen phase. You may have heard the term telogen effluvium is a type of hair loss where a large portion of hair goes into the telogen phase all at once, causing excessive shedding. That's called telogen effluvium because the hairs are going into this resting stage. That can last again up to 3 months, and then the hair returns to a growth phase. The follicle returns to a growth phase where the papilla comes up to the follicle and starts producing a hair again, and the hair shaft may push out the one that's in there before. The new one may push out the old hair shaft. So, important thing about this growth cycle. So at any given point during the day, you can lose up to 50 to 100 hairs, is what the consensus is, depending on how thick your hair is. So at any given point during the day, you brush your hair or you wash your hair, you can see this shedding. This is normal fallout, and it's fallout that's going to happen regardless of whether or not you wash your hair. So a lot of times people will reduce their hair washing because when they wash their hair, they see all this hair fallout. It's really important to remember that hair fallout is normal. Now, because every day there are more and more hairs going into this telogen or resting phase that can now come out in the shower, the longer you wait between showerings and shampooings, the more hair loss you're going to see when you shower. So this is really important. So a lot of people will reduce their hair washing because they think, oh, the hair washing is causing my hair to fall out. It's actually just hair building up in the telogen phase that's going to fall out regardless. So when you do wash your hair, this is where you see most of it. Some will come out shedding, some will just fall out on the floor, and some will come out when the hair follicle returns to the growth phase. We call this return to anagen or early anagen. The new growing hair can actually push the old hair out. So if it hasn't fallen out in the shower or brushing, then it couldn't just fall out. It could fall out when the new hair pushes it out. So, important thing to remember is washing does not increase hair loss. Matter of fact, the less you wash, the more hair loss you're going to see at each shower. It's not technically hair loss, it's just shedding, natural shedding, hairs entering the telogen phase. Because if you don't, what happens is you end up with things like this. So what we see here is a scalp close up. We see lots of flaking. We see lots of buildup of scales on the scalp. This is a combination of oils and other impurities. We've got dead skin and we've got fungal presence. We also have increased inflammation, which can increase hair loss. So it's important to frequently wash your hair to keep it as clean as possible, keep your scalp as clean as possible in order to have a healthier environment for hair growth. So if you reduce your washing, you're actually probably eventually going to increase your hair loss because your scalp now is no longer healthy enough to support healthy hair growth. So to return to the hair growth phase, or stages, I had mentioned earlier that there are extra stages in here that I think that it's important to understand. So I modified this diagram a little bit, and I put in between the telogen, which is the resting phase, and the return to anagen or early anagen phase, these two stages here called exogen and kenogen. So exogen is when the hair actually comes out of the follicle. So when the hair, so here actually it's coming, it shows a picture of it coming out, that would be called exogen. That doesn't take long. It can happen in the shower as we talked about, or it can fall out naturally. Now kenogen is an important stage because this is a stage where the hair follicle is empty and not growing. So what happens here is after, when the hair is in the telogen phase, it could fall out in the shower, and then the new hair hasn't grown in yet. So that delay in between is called kenogen. Now increased kenogen phases, like the time length of kenogen phase, is something that can happen in androgenetic alopecia. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here is a typical picture of androgenetic alopecia. What we see is, just a few really healthy, thick hairs, and the majority of the hairs are thinner, finer than the healthier ones. And we also see a lot of hairs in early anagen phase. So that means there's a increased shedding. The hair is regrowing, but it may not stay in this growth phase very long before it falls out again. Now, when the hair falls out in androgenetic alopecia, it often takes months and months before it returns. So therefore we see these little empty follicles. They may be a little bit hard to see, but these little patches here are actually empty follicles that are in the kenogen phase. So when you have all this hair in the kenogen phase, this contributes to the thin look of pattern hair loss. Also, of course, the finer hairs and shorter hairs contribute to that thin hair look as well, but also the resting phase. Now the kenogen phase. Now these follicles aren't dead necessarily. They may produce hair again in a few months' time, but the kenogen phase is elongated, so it creates more spaces in between your hair shafts. And finally, I'd just like to show this picture of a typical scalp. This is the back of a scalp. You can see that the majority of the hair are nice, healthy, thick hairs. What's interesting to notice here is that there are an increased number of hairs in the early anagen phase. So these are little short ones that are just regrowing. So what's happened here is the person had increased shedding, but the hair is now growing back. So normally when we look at the back of a scalp and there's no hair loss or increased shedding, we may see one regrowing hair in this whole area. This is a very small area. It's only about 1/4 square centimeter. So these little hairs are very, very short. So normally we will only see 1 or 2 at the most hairs in this area, but here we're seeing almost a dozen. What this means is the person had an increased shedding. That's something called telogen effluvium. This is evidence of it when you see a lot of regrowth. Nice thing here is that the hair is coming back and regrowing after a shed that was due to some kind of stressor. Incidentally, just to note that in telogen effluvium, the hair usually restores itself once the stressor that caused the hair loss is resolved. So that's our talk today about the hair growth cycle and what it sort of looks like. Stay tuned for more follow-up seminars.